In the early 1980s, the small suburban community of Lakewood, Ohio, was a picturesque postcard of American life. The city was known for its tree-lined streets, neat rows of middle-class homes with freshly painted white picket fences, and a bustling downtown area where families would gather for Sunday brunch or a quick stop at the local hardware store. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone, where porch lights glowed late into the night and children played without fear in cul-de-sacs until their parents called them home. At least, that's how people perceived it on the surface. But by mid-1982, an unsettling undercurrent began to ripple through the community. At first, no one wanted to admit that something was wrong. After all, missing persons reports were rare in Lakewood, and even when someone disappeared, it was often chalked up to a domestic squabble or a young adult leaving town in search of adventure. But as weeks turned into months, whispers began to spread at neighborhood gatherings, PTA meetings, and backyard barbecues. People spoke in hushed tones about familiar faces that seemed to vanish. The store clerk who hadn't shown up in days, the handyman who never finished repairs at Mrs. Holman's house on Elm Street, or the loner who lived on the edge of town whose mailbox was overflowing with unopened letters. These weren't just coincidences. The disappearances grew in frequency and peculiarity. They involved ordinary folks, plumbers, delivery drivers, landscapers, people who, as it turned out, shared a common thread of being transient, socially unremarkable, or disconnected from their families. The kind of people who could slip out of anyone's memory, the kind who didn't leave a crowd demanding answers when they were gone. Carl Simmons, the owner of the neighborhood florist shop, recalled a troubling pattern. During a casual talk with his customers, he noticed that a surprising number of people were recently inquiring about arrangements for missing neighbors, and not for joyful occasions like weddings or birthdays. "It's strange, isn't it?" one older woman had commented while nervously clutching her purse. "So many folks just disappearing. You think something's going on?" Carl brushed it off with a polite chuckle, but the question lingered in his mind long after she left the shop. By late August of 1982, the local police department finally began taking the matter more seriously, but they were still restrained by the limitations of the time. Information between districts wasn't easily shared in those pre-digital days, and unless a family continuously pressed the authorities, a missing persons file could become forgotten amidst the mounting workload. This allowed those early cases to almost fade entirely from official records. But the tide of dread sweeping through the streets of Lakewood was undeniable. Then came the sightings, fleeting and fantastic accounts that only deepened the sense of unease. Neighbors swore they noticed a black pickup truck slowly driving down streets at odd hours of the night, its windows obscured by curtains or tinted glass. Children reported hearing strange noises in the woods behind their schoolyard, the shuffle of heavy boots, the muted roar of whispered voices. Some heard the rumors of the abandoned yellow house on Quincy Lane, where, according to teenage ghost stories, bad things had happened years ago. Despite this unease, life went on in Lakewood. The ice cream parlor was still filled with laughter on sunny afternoons. The 4th of July parade ran smoothly, as Miss Callahan's marching band played loud enough to drown out any rising panic among the townsfolk. Beneath the surface, though, something dark and menacing was growing. No one yet knew whose street it would touch next, or whose face on the town bulletin board might soon have "Missing" printed in bold letters beneath it. It wasn't long before the whispers transformed into something louder, something desperate. Comments passed along in whispers by friends and acquaintances began appearing in local editorials and letters to the editor. "Our town isn't built for this kind of fear," one impassioned father wrote. "Someone, somewhere, has answers. We need answers." Local businesses began locking their doors a little earlier, especially in the fall as daylight grew shorter. Mothers held their children closer, warning them not to venture too far from home. And yet, no one wanted to outright declare it. Something was horribly wrong with Lakewood. It wasn't until the spring of 1983 that the mystery deepened, in a way that the town would never forget. When the name Edward Harris, a reclusive man seen around town but hardly noticed, would become irrevocably linked to the growing number of missing residents, everything about Lakewood's suburban calm splintered into chaos. But at this point, the seeds of dread were firmly planted, and the quiet suburban dream was slowly unraveling, thread by thread, shadow by shadow. The first clues. The first signs that something wasn't right came in the form of Mark Allen, a 38-year-old plumber known for his reliability and quiet demeanor. Mark had been scheduled to handle a simple repair job in the quaint Lakewood neighborhood, attending to a leaky faucet at one of the older houses on Elm Street. He loaded his trusty red van that morning, neatly arranging his toolkit in the back, kissed his wife goodbye, and promised he'd be home by dinner. But dinner came and went, and Mark didn't return. At first, his wife, Linda, wasn't too worried. Perhaps the job had run long. Maybe he stopped by the hardware store for parts or had drinks with his brother Sam, who lived nearby. But when the night dragged into early morning with no call and his cell phone, still relatively new technology in the early 80s, going straight to voicemail, Linda's worry deepened. She called the client on Elm Street, a widow named Mrs. Holman. But the call didn't reassure her. Mrs. Holman explained that Mark never arrived at their scheduled time. In fact, she hadn't seen him at all that day. Linda called the local police the next morning, but the initial response was subdued, almost indifferent. Missing person reports from adults weren't treated with urgency unless foul play was apparent. "He's probably just taking some time to clear his head," the officer had said in a disinterested tone. But Linda knew better. Mark was not the type to vanish without a word. The man carried a pocket planner everywhere, logging every hour of every day. Disappearing into thin air was simply out of character. The weeks following Mark's disappearance were filled with persistent questions and no satisfying answers. Flyers bearing his warm smile were plastered on telephone poles and the community bulletin board at the local diner. Church groups started bake sales and car washes to fund a private investigator. Linda called every hospital, rest stop, and motel within a 100-mile radius of Lakewood. But nothing, not a single trace of her husband, surfaced. As tragic as Mark's case was, it might not have drawn the community's attention for long had it not been followed by another strange occurrence just a month later. A landscaper named Toby Green, known for his humor and kind nature, didn't return home one evening after finishing work in a neighboring town. Toby's loyal German shepherd Max was found tied to a fence near his last job site, barking anxiously. But of Toby himself? Once again there was nothing, no wallet, no car, no phone. From there, it escalated. A delivery driver on his usual run failed to return to the distribution center. A young couple traveling cross-country on their honeymoon sent postcards to their families from Lakewood, happily recounting their visit to the town's historic district, but were never heard from again. By the end of 1982, at least 5 similar cases had been reported, though the connections weren't apparent at the time. The mysterious disappearances started gaining notoriety among local businesses. Carl Simmons, the florist, began noticing something unsettling in his customer interactions. "It's the darndest thing," he'd told his wife one evening. "Nowadays, most people walking in aren't looking for bouquets for anniversaries or birthdays. It's for memorials, or just to leave flowers for someone who's gone missing." Carl didn't know Mark Allen or Toby Green personally, but even he couldn't shake the strange feeling sweeping through the neighborhood. By early 1983, an unnerving pattern began to emerge, though it remained subtle enough to evade police scrutiny. The victims all had practical hands-on jobs: repairmen, gardeners, tradespeople, transient workers, people who were often seen working alone, who traveled by necessity yet never stayed in one place for too long. They were the invisible threads holding suburban life together, necessary but rarely noticed. Even in hindsight, it was chillingly logical. They were the kinds of people whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms in a busy world. One of the cryptic pieces of evidence linked to one disappearance was a gas receipt. Found on the roadside leading out of Lakewood, it was crumpled, dog-eared, but readable enough to identify the name of the filling station just east of town, the last place Mark Allen's van had been spotted in the days following his disappearance. The gas attendant there only vaguely remembered the red van stopping by, but could offer no significant details. "Middle of a busy rush hour," the man shrugged, brushing it off. "Could have been anyone driving it." Then there was the strange discovery made by the Wilson kids, middle school twins living near the edge of the woods that backed up against Quincy Lane. On an unseasonably warm February afternoon, they'd ventured deeper into the forest than usual, looking for a spot to build their treehouse. That's when they found it. A battered work boot lodged between the roots of a massive oak tree. It looked almost ancient, dirt-streaked and waterlogged, but the brand name, stamped into the cracked leather, was relatively recent. More chillingly, when one of the boys turned it over, tufts of human hair spilled out from inside, triggering immediate screams. The police retrieved the boot the same day. The official reports noted that although the hair was consistent with several cases, DNA technology at the time wasn't yet sophisticated enough to pinpoint an identification. Forensic officers dismissed it as inconclusive evidence, much to the frustration of the families desperate for answers. More unnerving sightings trickled into local folklore. A jogger swore she saw a man in a black trench coat emerging from the woods with a shovel at dawn, silhouetted against a pale gray sky. A pair of teenagers sneaking into the old abandoned house on Quincy Lane for a late-night thrill claimed to have heard muffled voices, followed by what they swore were faint screams. It didn't take long for rumors to morph into urban legends. The newspapers, in typical sensational fashion, dubbed them the Vanishing Workers of Lakewood. But the most confusing puzzle piece of all came in the form of a series of messages scribbled in chalk across various sidewalks around town, cryptic phrases like "help me" and "he watches after dark." When questioned about them, a woman walking her dog admitted seeing someone she described as unkempt and nervous, bending over the pavement in the early hours of the morning. But she shrugged it off, assuming it had been teenage pranksters or perhaps a drug user losing his mind. The police insisted that there was no solid connection between the cases yet, but the air of unease around Lakewood was thickening. What had once been perceived as mere coincidences began to rear their heads as fragments of a much more sinister picture. The first critical breakthrough wasn't far off, but the question on everyone's mind remained. Was it already too late for those who had seemingly vanished without a trace? The investigation begins. By the time police officially turned their attention to the troubling disappearances in late 1983, the sense of unease in Lakewood had grown into a low hum of panic. Missing persons flyers cluttered coffee shop notice boards, grocery stores taped them to windows next to "Help Wanted" signs. What started as isolated incidents had spiraled into a grim pattern, with whispers of conspiracy, foul play, and something darker casting long shadows over the quiet suburban streets. Initially, the Lakewood Police Department was overwhelmed and, to some extent, underprepared. It wasn't the kind of town where law enforcement was accustomed to handling high-profile or resource-intensive cases. Most of their daily responsibilities revolved around minor traffic violations or disputes over barking dogs and HOA bylaws. They were a tight-knit group of officers with little experience in major investigations, let alone missing persons on such a scale. Detective James "Jim" Whitaker was the man in charge of assembling the pieces of an increasingly chaotic puzzle. A middle-aged cop with thinning hair and a perpetual coffee stain on his beige trench coat, Jim had seen his fair share of small-town crimes, but nothing like this. "I've got a bad feeling about all this," he muttered to his partner, Detective Laura Peterson, as they pored over the growing stack of case files sprawled across the desk in their dimly lit office. "Either we've got the unluckiest town in America, or something is seriously off here." Laura, sharp-eyed and fresh out of her rotation with a precinct in Cleveland, leaned back in her chair. She tapped her pen against her lips as she scanned the latest report. Toby Green, the landscaper, last seen on the east side of town. "It's not just unlucky," she said. "There's a pattern here. Most of these people, they worked check to check, lived alone, or had jobs that made them mobile. Plumbers, landscapers, delivery drivers, they're like ghosts before they're even missing." Jim grunted and cracked his knuckles. "Transient, low connections, folks most people wouldn't notice are gone." His voice had an edge of regret. He shuffled through the files again, pulling out photos clipped to reports. "Look at this, Laura. Mark Allen, got a wife and 2 kids, sure, but mostly kept his head down. Toby, lived with his damn dog. No big family screaming for attention around here. These aren't the people who make the news." As they dug deeper into the cases, one name kept cropping up in unlikely places. Edward Harris, a quiet, reclusive man who lived alone on the edge of town, in a small, nondescript house surrounded by overgrown bushes and leaning picket fences. He was hardly more than a shadow in Lakewood society, a loner known for his uneasy smile and his habit of avoiding eye contact. Neighbors called him eccentric, but harmless. "Just old Ed," they'd say with a shrug, recounting uneventful tales of fleeting encounters with the menial handyman. What piqued the detective's interest, however, was the fact that Edward seemed to have crossed paths with many of the missing individuals before their disappearances. An old receipt for plumbing work found in Mark Allen's van led police to his street. A neighbor of Toby Green remembered seeing Toby loading tools into his truck near Edward's yard. And then there was the unsettling testimony from a smattering of locals, who mentioned seeing Ed's black pickup truck idling near trails and side roads at odd hours of the night. "He's got the perfect profile," Laura mused one late evening in the precinct. the glow of her desk lamp highlighting the bags under her eyes. "He's a nobody, quiet. People forget he exists until they snap their fingers and go, 'Oh right, Ed.' He'd know who's vulnerable. He'd know who wouldn't be missed." Without more concrete evidence, though, the police had little to go on. The legal standards of the time were less forgiving than they would be decades later. And so began the delicate balancing act. Surveil Edward, study his connections, but make no move that would alert him or upset the town even further. Surveillance was arduous. Edward rarely left his home for anything but groceries or gas. Detectives took turns sitting in unmarked cars down the block from his property, watching his curtained windows for signs of activity. For weeks, the marshy quiet of Ohio's approach to winter swallowed whole days of observation. Dinner plates piled up in Edward's trash outside, but no visitors came inside. The black pickup truck occasionally disappeared for hours but returned without incident. In their boredom, officers began to filter through archived records for anything to confirm suspicions. One junior detective uncovered a deposit slip from 1979 at a local bank. A minor detail, but it showed Edward had come into a sum of nearly $900, an implausible amount given his known odd jobs. Where had that come from? Was it saved up? Stolen? No logical connection was apparent at the time, but even Jim couldn't shake the eerie weight of the detail. What pushed the investigation forward, however, was the discovery of one critical clue, an odd pattern of dirt. Officer Brendan Hughes, one of the younger patrolmen, stopped his cruiser near Edward's house one rainy night and noticed something peculiar in the car's headlights. Shallow drag marks cutting through the mud way out past the farthest edge of Edward's backyard. They led into a dense thicket adjoining a wooded stretch of no man's land. Brendan radioed Jim almost immediately. "Detective, it doesn't feel right. There's something out back. A sinkhole maybe? Or, damn it, I don't know, you'd better see it." The following morning, Jim, Laura, and a small team walked the perimeter with flashlights and boots thick with mud. Laura crouched low, running her fingers over the marks. "This wasn't a wheelbarrow or a gardener," she said, her voice unusually quiet. "Too heavy, too deliberate." Jim's stomach churned. "So what are you saying?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "It looks like someone was dragging something," she murmured. She straightened, staring into the dark expanse of tangled branches beyond. Or someone. Search warrants followed. Teams with spades and cadaver dogs combed through Edward Harris's backyard, slowly chipping away at the suburban calm that had shrouded the home for years. What had started as a quiet missing persons investigation now threatened to crack Lakewood wide open. The horrific secrets inside the house. It was February of 1984, when the Lakewood Police Department executed the search warrant for Edward Harris's property. For weeks, detectives Jim Whitaker and Laura Peterson had meticulously built their case, piecing together eyewitness accounts, odd circumstantial evidence, and those haunting drag marks in the mud. Now, standing in the driveway of the reclusive handyman's rundown suburban shack, flanked by officers and forensic teams, Jim felt a heaviness settle in his gut. The house itself was unimpressive but eerily so. It was the kind of home you could pass by 100 times and never once think to look twice at. 2 stories tall but sagging under years of neglect, it was surrounded by a yard of knotted weeds and decaying bushes. Rust streaked the gutters like dried blood, and all the windows were curtained off, hiding whatever lay inside. The front screen door made a soft creak as Jim knocked. For a stretch of seconds there was only silence. When Edward Harris opened the door, the officers were struck by his calm demeanor. His face was pale and weathered, with a grayish hue that gave him the look of a man who hadn't seen the sun in years. He stared at them through wire-rimmed glasses, his gaze hollow yet calculating. "Officers," he said plainly, his voice flat. "What's this about?" "We have a warrant to search the premises, Mr. Harris," Jim announced, his hand resting lightly on the paper in his coat pocket. Edward hesitated but eventually stepped aside without protest, his movements slower than what felt natural, almost robotic. The foyer was as lifeless as the man himself. The interior smelled damp and musty, a stagnant odor that clung to the back of their throats. Dust motes floated in the thin shafts of light slicing into the dimly lit living room. Everywhere the officers looked, there was clutter. Old magazines stacked in leaning towers, yellowed newspapers covering the floor like a rotting carpet, cobwebbed lampshades casting an ominous glow. "This guy's been living like a ghost," Laura muttered, running her fingers across a nearby windowsill caked in grime. "I can't imagine anyone stepping foot in here willingly." Each room seemed worse than the last. A kitchen sink overrun with rust stains stood beneath a leaking faucet. Piles of unwashed dishes teetered precariously, some ringed with mold so thick it looked like it had grown roots. Empty beer cans covered the counters, and the fridge hummed a low, menacing drone. It all looked like the home of a lonely hoarder, until they reached the basement. The door to the basement was slightly ajar, revealing a steep staircase descending into a suffocating void of darkness. No light bulbs illuminated what lay below, and the air that drifted upward was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that set the hairs on the back of Laura's neck on end. "Jim," she said, gripping his sleeve before he could descend. "Something's off." "Yeah," he replied grimly, unholstering his flashlight. "Let's find out how off." The first thing they noticed as they stepped down was the silence, an oppressive, unnatural silence that felt thick enough to cut with a knife. The basement floor was made of dirt, not concrete, and it had been disturbed. Large patches of soil stood freshly packed, the ridges in the dirt marking the unmistakable imprint of a shovel. Jim waved for the forensic team to come forward as he scanned the room. Along one wall stood a workbench cluttered with odds and ends, gardening tools coated in congealed rust, stacks of rope, an assortment of mismatched gloves. A tarpaulin was spread across the far corner of the room, covering what appeared to be a large, peculiar mound. Laura stared at it for a long, tense moment before looking at Jim, hoping for some kind of reassurance she knew he couldn't give. Slowly, cautiously, they approached. Jim reached out and pulled at the edge of the tarp. The movement disturbed the air, sending a sour, nauseating odor spiraling into the room. It took a moment for their eyes to process what lay beneath, but when it registered, the reality hit like a gut punch. Skeletal remains, brittle and yellowing, arranged unnaturally, as if someone had deliberately posed them. The first skeleton lay fetal, clutching its knees, while another had its arms bizarrely crossed in a silent mockery of rest. Laura stumbled back, pressing her sleeve against her mouth to muffle her gagging. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How many are there?" "Too many," Jim muttered, his voice tight with disgust. "We need to call it in." The forensic team set to work immediately, painstakingly cataloging what would later prove to be only the start of their nightmarish discovery. In total, 5 sets of human remains were uncovered from that single corner of the basement. Each body had been buried in increasingly shallow graves, as though Edward had grown careless, or confident, that no one would ever come knocking. Then they found the freezer. It was an older model, the kind with an old-fashioned latch that clicked shut instead of sealing magnetically. Chillingly, it was still functional, buzzing softly in the corner like it had been waiting all this time. When the team popped it open, they found the body of a young woman frozen solid, her pale face contorted in a grimace of terror. Unlike the skeletons, she had only been dead for a few months. Her body showed signs consistent with strangulation, whatever shred of denial the detectives had clung to, trying to rationalize the scene as something less than deliberate, an abandoned house overtaken by tragedy, or accidental deaths Edward had covered up in panic, vanished. This was calculated madness. This house was a prison for the lost. As the search extended to the backyard, the horror continued. Beneath the overgrown weeds and rusting garden tools, a total of 11 more bodies were found buried in shallow, hastily dug graves. Some of the corpses showed signs of restraint, bruising around the wrists or ankles, blunt force trauma to the head. Others were harder to identify, their features obliterated by decay and time. One by one, the lifeless faces of Lakewood's missing came to light. By the end of the 3-day search, the total count stood at 17. 17 victims of Edward Harris's twisted spree. The man who neighbors only knew as the strange and quiet guy at the edge of town had turned his home into the resting place for numerous innocent souls. Jim's voice broke the tension during one of the late nights as they packed up evidence. "I've been on the force for 20 years, Laura, seen things I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. But this?" He paused, his lips drawing into a thin line. "This is something else." As Harris was escorted out in handcuffs and his house was sealed off as a crime scene, the shockwaves rippled through Lakewood. For a town that prided itself on safety and community, the discovery of this house of horrors would forever change how people viewed their quaint suburban haven. The shocking victim count. The grim tally of Edward Harris's victims grew with shocking rapidity over the course of the excruciating 3-day search of his property. What began with an initial discovery of skeletal remains in the basement spiraled into something far darker, a nightmarish excavation that revealed the true scale of horror hiding beneath the small, decrepit house on the edge of Lakewood. By the end of the first day, officers had recovered 5 sets of human remains from the basement alone. Each body was buried with terrifying precision, packed tightly into shallow dirt graves, their brittle bones arranged as if someone had spent far too much time ensuring they didn't take up too much space. Forensics teams worked silently under the glaring light of flood lamps, masks covering their faces to block both the stench of decay and the mounting dread. Standing off to the side, Detective Laura Peterson rubbed her temples and muttered to Jim, "This isn't random, Jim. He's got a system, a process. He didn't care who they were, but he cared enough about where he put them." "There's method in his madness," Jim replied grimly. His cigarette trembled ever so slightly in his hand as he spoke, the weight of the discovery beginning to pull at his usually steady demeanor. "This guy's been doing this for years and nobody noticed." But what rattled everyone the most wasn't just the merciless precision, it was the chilling realization that there was more. Much more. On the second day, teams moved to the backyard. Beneath the tangle of weeds, rusting garden tools, and piles of discarded trash, a cadaver dog barked sharply, pawing at the dirt. Within hours, the digging began again. By the time nightfall blanketed the small neighborhood, 6 additional bodies had been unearthed. Some were in significantly advanced states of decomposition, to the point where distinguishing features had been reduced to bone fragments and scraps of clothing. Others, as in cases closer to the surface, were fresher, their flesh preserved just enough to make the bruising and signs of trauma unmistakable. The backyard became a makeshift crime scene riddled with orange evidence markers as bodies were pulled from the earth one by one. What disturbed detectives most were the restraints found with many of the bodies. Frayed ropes, rusted handcuffs, makeshift bindings fashioned from electrical wire. Bruising on the wrists and ankles told tales of struggle, of lives stolen under duress and pain. Some bodies showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, while others carried the unmistakable marks of strangulation. It was clear these weren't remotely merciful deaths. Harris had killed with a deliberate cruelty, one that only grew bolder with time. 17 and counting, Laura whispered as she stared out over the dimly lit yard late that evening, her breath fogging in the brisk February air. "Can you even believe that? 17 human beings just gone, lost, and we didn't even know." "Not until they were right under our noses," Jim murmured, shaking his head as he flicked ashes onto the ground. You'd think someone would notice something like this, but Harris? He set himself up perfectly, out of sight, out of mind." The tally was staggering. 5 bodies from the basement, 6 from the backyard by the second night. What terrified investigators most wasn't even the count itself, disturbing as it was the fact that it didn't seem finished. Forensics officers had noted that some of the shallow backyard graves bore signs of movement, as though Harris himself had gone back to dig and redeposit remains in different places over time. "Why would he move them?" one young officer asked in a hushed tone, his hands trembling as he tagged another evidence marker. "What's the point?" "Maybe he was running out of room," another officer muttered. "Or maybe he just liked going back to check on them." "That's disgusting," Laura shot back, her tone sharp and cutting. "But then again, you're probably right." As if the graveyard in the backyard wasn't horrifying enough, the crime scene investigators were still analyzing the contents of the freezer in the basement. The woman inside was one of Harris's more recent victims. Reports later confirmed she'd been missing for just over 4 months, a local waitress in her late 20s who frequented the diner on the other side of town. Her case had gone largely unnoticed, except for a single article in the local paper, written by her grieving sister. "Harris didn't even bury her," Jim said, raking a hand through his hair as he reviewed the preliminary forensic reports. "He just stored her like she was nothing more than frozen food." And then came the question no one wanted to ask, but everyone was thinking, were there more victims? Was this exhaustive search even close to uncovering the true scope of what Harris had done? For every grave they dug, officers couldn't help but wonder how many more might never be found. The tactic Harris used, targeting transient individuals, those with few personal connections or weak ties to the community, made it frighteningly easy for his crimes to stretch beyond anyone's worst guesses. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the final body was unearthed. A total of 17 victims in all, 17 people silently erased from the world, their lives stolen in the most brutal and dehumanizing ways imaginable. Among them were tradesmen and laborers, a traveling salesman, a college student passing through town, and even the honeymooning couple whose mysterious postcard had been the last communication with their families. The specifics of their lives varied. But one universal truth connected them all. They had crossed paths with Edward Harris, and they had never left. 17, Jim muttered under his breath as he sat on the hood of his patrol car late that evening, cigarette dangling forgotten from his lips. His eyes stared out into the darkness, the distant glow of Harris's house still barely visible beyond the silhouettes of trees. How the hell does that even happen? How does someone kill 17 people without a soul noticing? Laura looked at him, exhaustion and disbelief etched into her features. Because no one looked, Jim. No one wanted to. People like Harris, they play on that. They count on everyone else just minding their own business, trusting their little bubble of suburbia. As the news of the horrific discovery spread, the small town of Lakewood was thrown into a vortex of shock, mourning, and disbelief. The victim count wasn't a statistic. It became a symbol of the failure to see behind the veil, to understand the evil that had festered right in their midst. For every family that finally learned the fate of their loved ones, there were others left with uncertainty. Uncertainty over whether their missing had simply vanished, or whether Harris carried secrets they might never uncover. The long process of naming the 17 victims had only just begun, but for the people of Lakewood, the number 17 was more than just a tally. It was a haunting echo, a reminder that in the shadows of their town something monstrous had taken root, unnoticed for far, far too long. The cold-blooded killer's methods. The investigation into Edward Harris's actions revealed not just a man capable of horrific acts, but one who carried out his crimes with a disturbing level of precision, calculation, and what could only be described as pure detachment. To the people of Lakewood, he was the strange guy no one really knew, the type of man whose name was rarely mentioned in conversation. But behind closed doors, the Edward Harris they didn't know was something far darker, far colder, and far more deliberate than anyone could have ever imagined. Edward didn't kill out of rage or impulsivity. He killed because it was methodical. And more disturbingly, because it gave him satisfaction. Unlike crimes born of desperation or passion, Edward's method spoke of preparation, control, and patience. He wasn't afraid of being caught. He wasn't worried about leaving evidence. He chose his victims carefully, and every detail of his predatory behavior suggested a predator who had mastered his craft over years. What stood out most to detectives like Jim Whitaker and Laura Peterson was just how easy it was for Harris to lure his victims. He didn't need elaborate schemes or violent confrontations. Instead, his charm, if it could be called that, relied on his unassuming nature. He wasn't imposing or overtly threatening. He was just Ed, the quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and a hesitant smile that made him seem harmless, an invisible figure in a town like Lakewood. Harris typically targeted individuals whose daily lives required small, routine interactions with strangers, repairmen, delivery drivers, tradesmen, landscapers, people who lived on the fringe, financially or socially, who worked with their hands and rarely stayed in one place long enough to form deep ties to a community. These were people nobody paid much attention to until it was too late. His method of approach was chillingly simple. Harris would rely on the everyday needs of his crumbling house to bait his victims. A leaky pipe here, a patch of roof in need of shingles there. He would call a contractor or a repair tech, meeting them at the door with a meek nod and an outstretched hand. "It's right back here," he'd say softly, leading them around the property or into the dim interior of his home. Witnesses described Harris as polite, almost pleasant, during interactions with neighbors or acquaintances, though he often avoided eye contact and kept conversations brief. Quiet but calculated, that was Harris's way. According to investigators, once a victim stepped into his home, the dynamic would shift. The house itself, awash in clutter and shadows, reeking of mildew and decay, acted as an ominous stage. All exits led directly back through Harris's line of sight. Victims soon found themselves isolated, out of earshot of anyone who might hear a scream, and trapped by the dim, suffocating surroundings. Harris's escalation was deliberate. He often targeted his victims when they were most vulnerable, alone, distracted, or nearing the end of a workday when fatigue set in, making quick decisions feel natural. Once inside, Harris reportedly subdued his victims using a mix of cunning and overwhelming force. Tranquilizers and rope restraints were found among the contents of his basement toolkit. These weren't ordinary items lying around for incidental use. They were carefully cataloged tools for subduing and immobilizing a person as swiftly and quietly as possible. Detective Laura Peterson noted during a case review, this wasn't someone losing control or acting on impulse. He plotted everything, right down to when to strike and what supplies he'd need. It was all staged, pre-planned. He wanted them alive long enough to feel they couldn't escape. That was part of it for him. Autopsies showed a consistent pattern among many of Harris's victims. Bruising around the wrists and ankles painted the picture of someone restrained, held captive until the final moments. Strangulation was Harris's preferred method of killing, intimate and silent, ensuring complete domination over his victims without the noise or mess of a weapon. Forensic specialists believed he deliberately avoided bloodshed because it was cleaner and easier to hide, and yet the ways in which he displayed his victims, posed, buried, or in one case preserved in a freezer, hinted at a darker, more disturbing layer of control over the people he killed. Harris didn't just kill them, Jim said to Laura during one particularly grim briefing. He made them trophies, each one of those bodies. They mattered to him in a way that's even more terrifying than if they didn't matter at all. He wanted to keep them close, hidden, but close. The use of his basement as a holding space revealed further evidence of Harris's cold-blooded approach. The earth floor wasn't haphazard, it was practical. A place that allowed him to dispose of bodies quickly without transporting them elsewhere. Detectives theorized that Harris spent hours, even days, studying how to dig precise, shallow graves in the dirt while ensuring they couldn't be disturbed by outside forces. The tarpaulin spread across graves in his basement served as his version of care, maintaining some level of control even in his victims' deaths. One of the most unsettling discoveries came in the form of a handwritten journal retrieved from Harris's bedroom during the house search. It wasn't a confession, it was worse. The notebook, bound in cracked leather and warped from humidity, contained pages of cryptic notes, lists, and fragmented thoughts. "Easy to handle," read one entry next to a date detectives later matched to the estimated disappearance of a landscaper named Toby Green. "Came right in," another scribbled line read, scrawled with an eerie detachment. "Knew it would be fast." While the journal offered no direct admissions of guilt, it painted an unsettling portrait of how Harris perceived his victims. They weren't people to him, they were opportunities. Detectives struggled to reconcile the man's monotone calm during questioning with the horrifying extent of his crimes. This was someone who not only enjoyed their silence but actively planned it. Even Harris's black pickup truck, spotted so often in the woods or idling late at night, fitted perfectly into his quiet strategy. Investigators seized the vehicle and uncovered evidence linking it to at least 5 of the victims: fibers from a jacket, scuffs from a repairman's boot, fingerprints too partial to identify but undeniably human. They theorized Harris used the truck to transport victims or supplies when necessary, though most of his crimes took place inside the fortress of his house. "It's like he designed his whole life around making himself invisible," Laura said one night after re-examining photos from inside the home. "He was so quiet, so predictable. His life made it easy for him to disappear into the same shadows he used to target other people." Harris's methods weren't just cold-blooded, they were habitual. To the very end he showed no remorse, no flicker of humanity that might have hinted at regret. When detectives questioned him about the escalating number of victims linked to his property, Harris simply stared at them through the wire glasses perched on his nose. His reply, chilling in its emptiness, was, "They're just people no one cared about. I kept them because no one else would." Every detail of Edward Harris's methods told one unavoidable truth. This was a man whose actions were not random. This was a killer who didn't just thrive off his crimes, he perfected them, refining his chilling craft over years of practice. And in a small town like Lakewood, surrounded by quiet streets and trusting faces, he had the perfect playing field. Uncovering the past and motive. As investigators dug deeper into Edward Harris's horrifying crimes, they quickly realized that solving the mystery of how he killed wasn't enough. The why, the elusive motive behind the sheer brutality of his spree, hung like a heavy shadow over the case. What could push a quiet, unassuming man in suburban Ohio to become one of the most methodical and cold-blooded serial killers in American history? To answer this, detectives Jim Whitaker and Laura Peterson turned their attention to Harris's past. Edward Harris had always been a loner. Born in Lakewood in 1942, he was the youngest of 3 siblings in what neighbors would later describe as the sort of family you didn't ask too many questions about. His father, Thomas Harris, was a factory laborer and a strict disciplinarian, brutally so according to court records unearthed from that time. Discipline in the Harris household wasn't just harsh, it bordered on sadistic. From an early age, Edward experienced the sharp edge of his father's belt for even the smallest infractions. "Quiet boys don't cause trouble," Thomas was quoted as saying to a neighbor who once questioned the bruises on young Edward's arms. Thomas's cruelty extended far beyond beatings. Family acquaintances, and there weren't many, claimed he would lock Edward in the unfinished basement for hours at a time when the boy failed to finish household chores. That basement, dim and damp, became a prison where Edward learned to sit silently, utterly still, until his father deemed him worthy of being let out. Later, psychological profiles would suggest this kind of prolonged isolation formed the groundwork for Harris's fractured psyche, teaching him to disassociate from fear and pain. His mother, Eleanor, was no savior. Overwhelmed and terrified of her volatile husband, she withdrew completely. Instead of comforting Edward, she encouraged compliance. "If you do what he says, it'll be over faster," she whispered once, when the young boy, shaking and tearful, begged to avoid punishment for spilling a cup of milk. The notion of isolation and silence as safety was etched into Edward even before he hit his teenage years. Edward's school years offered no reprieve. Quiet and withdrawn, he became the natural target for bullies who mocked his shabby clothes, his awkward gait, and his inability to look people in the eyes. Teachers often described him as barely there, a boy who completed his assignments without question but never made friends or spoke unless called upon. He would sit in the back of the classroom, his head down, his body language rigid. When other children were laughing in the cafeteria, Edward would sit alone, wolfing down his food hurriedly as though he feared every moment of attention might lead to ridicule. His report cards, later retrieved by journalists investigating his case, consistently read, "Edward does well enough academically but struggles socially. He needs to participate more." It was during his teenage years that the early signs of a darker side began to surface. Harris's fascination with control, particularly over small, helpless creatures, started to gain traction. A neighbor remembered catching Edward with a stray cat in his backyard. The neighbor's description, horror-stricken decades later, sent chills down spines. He wasn't playing with it. He was staring at it like it was a science project. He had this pocket knife, and this blank expression. God help me, I didn't stop him. It wasn't the only story. Children in the neighborhood began whispering about other animals that had gone missing, about strange noises coming from the Harris property late at night. Edward's reputation as the weird kid solidified. By the time he reached adulthood, Edward seemed to vanish entirely into the backdrop of Lakewood. He worked a string of menial jobs, delivery driver, handyman, gas station attendant, but never held one for very long. His co-workers recalled him as forgettable, polite but distant, and the kind of man you tried not to get stuck next to during a lunch break. He never married or dated, at least not publicly. Even his siblings, both of whom moved out of Lakewood as soon as they were old enough, couldn't recall staying in touch with him past their 20s. One of his brothers, when questioned after Edward's arrest, admitted, "I honestly forgot he even existed. He just sort of disappeared." The deeper the detectives dug, the clearer it became that Harris's crimes didn't result solely from his childhood, tragic as it was. Many people experience hardship without turning to violence. What separated Harris, psychologists theorized, was the unnatural satisfaction he derived from inflicting fear he understood all too intimately himself. Harris wasn't just killing for the sake of it, Laura explained during a post-arrest debriefing with reporters. This was about control, domination. He spent his whole childhood powerless, under the thumb of an abusive father and ignored by a neglectful mother. Somehow, in his own twisted way, killing gave him what his life had taken from him. This need for control manifested in the calculated patterns of his murders. He targeted victims who were transient, invisible members of society. These were men and women who reminded him of himself, people who could vanish without anyone organizing search parties or demanding answers. They were extensions of his own invisibility, and by taking their lives, Harris became the master of their existence, if only for a moment. One discovery in particular shocked even the most seasoned criminal psychologists. Tucked away in the back of his closet, investigators found a collection of outdated Polaroid photographs stored in a weathered shoebox. The photos were grainy and poorly lit but haunting in their content. Each depicted one of Harris's victims, still alive but bound and subdued, their faces twisted in terror. These weren't trophies in the traditional sense, they were mementos of power. One forensic psychologist later stated, for Harris, taking these photos wasn't about preserving his crimes, it was about savoring that moment of absolute control. The moment he knew they had no escape. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Harris's psyche was his utter lack of remorse. During his trial, when pressed to explain why he'd chosen to commit such atrocities, Harris responded with startling indifference. "They were no one. People who didn't matter. They were already lost before I found them." Even when presented with evidence of his cruelty, including testimonies from the families of his victims, Harris remained unaffected. "This man doesn't have a conscience in the traditional sense," one profiler concluded. "He doesn't see himself as evil. He sees himself as logical. To him, his reasoning makes sense, and that's what makes him so terrifying." By the end of the investigation into Edward Harris's past, one tragic truth stood out. This was a man created partly by circumstance, partly by his own choices, and wholly by a need to fill a void too dark for anyone to comprehend. For Lakewood, the revelations about Harris's childhood, motives, and patterns left an enduring scar. They were left to grapple with the uncomfortable question of whether someone like him could have been stopped earlier, if only someone had cared to see the signs. The investigation and challenges. The investigation into Edward Harris was, by every measure, a grueling and emotionally exhausting ordeal for the Lakewood police. What had initially started as a series of missing persons cases quickly escalated into one of the most harrowing murder investigations in the state's history. Yet for all the horrors uncovered at Harris's property, the bodies in the basement, the graves in the backyard, and the evidence of calculated cold-bloodedness, the investigation itself was plagued with challenges that tested the limits of the small-town police force. From the outset, the Lakewood Police Department found itself woefully unprepared for a case of such magnitude. Until Edward Harris, the majority of their daily work consisted of mediating neighbor disputes, issuing parking violations, and occasionally breaking up a bar fight on Main Street. Now they were facing an unthinkable investigation involving multiple homicides, human remains, forensic evidence, and the coordination of multiple agencies. "We're a small department," Jim Whitaker admitted to reporters months after Harris's arrest. "Hell, most of the guys on the force probably never even imagined themselves chasing down a serial killer. That just doesn't happen in a town like Lakewood, or so we thought." The moment the crime scene was discovered, the case outgrew the Lakewood PD almost instantly. By the end of the first day, they'd called in assistance from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI. Teams of forensic experts with state-of-the-art tools, at least by 1980s standards, arrived to sift through the gruesome evidence. Their arrival, while critical to the case, highlighted Lakewood's lack of resources. The small force had no experience handling extensive forensic analysis, or managing a major crime scene over multiple days. One of the first significant obstacles came in the form of identifying the remains. Most of Harris's victims were transient individuals, men and women without strong connections in the community. Some were drifters or laborers passing through town for work, while others were residents whom society had seemingly forgotten. This made identification painstakingly slow and emotionally excruciating. Limited by pre-DNA forensic technology, investigators had to rely on dental records, remnants of personal items, and an almost hopeless patchwork of missing persons cases from nearby towns. Many of the victims weren't even reported missing, Detective Laura Peterson explained during an early press briefing. No one was waiting for them. For some, there was no family desperately looking for answers, and that broke our hearts more than anything. It also made our jobs infinitely harder. Adding to the complexity was the condition of the remains themselves. Several of the bodies had been buried for years, rendering them skeletal. Others, particularly those found in the freezer and more recent graves, were better preserved but still degraded enough to make visual identification impossible. The forensic team painstakingly analyzed scraps of clothing, fragments of jewelry, and other personal effects found near the bodies. Every fragment told a story, or at least hinted at one, but piecing those stories together was a Herculean task. Beyond the logistical hurdles, the investigation team faced tremendous emotional strain. Officers who'd spent their entire careers feeling safe in their small town now couldn't walk the streets of Lakewood without wondering how such evil had gone unnoticed for so long. Jim Whitaker, known for his steadfast demeanor, admitted to waking up in cold sweats some nights, haunted by the faces of the victims or the hollow, unrepentant stare of Edward Harris during questioning. "This case, it gets in your head," Jim confided to Laura one night as they reviewed evidence in the dim glow of the precinct's fluorescent lights. "You see those faces, the lives he stole, and you start thinking, what kind of world lets something like this happen in a nice, quiet place like ours?" Laura nodded, tapping her pen anxiously on the desk. "It eats at me too, Jim," she said softly. "What scares me most is how calculated it all was. He didn't make mistakes. He knew exactly who he could go after, who wouldn't be missed. It's like he could see the cracks in society no one else wanted to look at." The public scrutiny only added to the weight of the investigation. News of Harris's arrest spread rapidly, turning Lakewood into the epicenter of national media coverage. Reporters camped out at the police station and even outside Jim and Laura's homes, hoping for exclusive updates on the case. The media frenzy, while shining a light on the severity of Harris's crimes, also fueled rumors and speculation. Wild theories circulated about additional victims, accomplices, and hidden horrors that had yet to be uncovered. Every day the phone at the precinct rang with tips that ranged from credible to absurd. "We had people calling in saying their cousin's roommate disappeared 15 years ago and they were sure Harris was behind it," Laura said later in an interview. "We wanted to follow every lead, but sorting fact from fiction became draining, especially for a team already stretched to its limit." Another unforeseen challenge came from the victims' families, those who had desperately waited for years or even decades for answers, and those just learning the horrifying fate of their loved ones. Some were grateful for the closure, even as it shattered their hearts. Others were angry, demanding to know why it had taken so long for someone to notice the pattern emerging in their town. "I can't describe how helpless we felt when talking to the families," Jim recounted. "You want to give them peace, to say something to make it better, but what can you say in the face of something like this? We found your son's remains buried in some bastard's backyard? It doesn't get worse than that." The investigation also faced another, quieter challenge: fear. While residents displayed outward sympathy for the police and the victims, few wanted to admit they'd ever interacted with Edward Harris. His reclusive nature meant that few people actually knew him, but those who did remained tight-lipped, worried their past encounters might tie them in some way to his crimes. A former neighbor admitted to seeing Harris digging in his backyard late at night years prior but never reported it, explaining to detectives, "It's just easier to keep your head down in a town like this, you know?" "There were times it felt like we were hitting a wall," Laura confessed to her partner one sleepless night while poring over records. "People knew more than they were letting on, but they were too scared to speak up. They'd rather live with guilt than risk getting involved." Even with these hurdles, the persistence of the Lakewood police, along with their state and federal counterparts, slowly but surely unraveled the full extent of Edward Harris's crimes. They overcame outdated technology, skeletal leads, uncooperative witnesses, and the emotional toll of the case to compile a mountain of damning evidence. But as the case finally moved toward trial, one question continued to haunt everyone involved: how had Harris kept his dark secret for so long? Identifying the victims. The gruesome work did not end with the discovery of the bodies at Edward Harris's property. In many ways that was only the beginning. For the investigators of the Lakewood Police Department, identifying the victims was one of the most painstakingly slow and emotionally draining aspects of the case. Behind every set of remains found beneath the dirt floor in the basement or hidden in the backyard graves was a name, a face, a story, and unearthing those was just as critical as uncovering the evidence that would damn Edward Harris. When the investigation began, 17 bodies had been uncovered at Harris's property. Of those, 11 were identified within months, thanks to a mix of old-fashioned detective work, dental records, and connections to previous missing persons cases. But for 6 of the victims, no identification emerged. They were nameless and unknown, shadows of their former selves. Detective Laura Peterson would describe the process later as a constant battle against time and trauma. Using the tools available in the early 1980s, investigators struggled to put names to skeletons. DNA technology as we know it today didn't yet exist, and forensic advancements were only beginning to emerge. Investigators were forced to rely on what little evidence they could recover from the remains: worn clothing, scattered jewelry, fragments of identification cards that had long since decayed, or peculiar distinguishing traits, such as dental restorations or broken bones that matched historical medical records. Each breakthrough in identifying a body came with its own heartbreak. One such moment was when investigators identified Mark Allen, the missing plumber whose disappearance had first tipped the Lakewood authorities to Harris's dark deeds. A crumpled gas receipt found near Mark's abandoned red van had been tied to the same filling station Edward Harris was known to frequent. Mark's remains, located in the backyard close to the southeast corner of Harris's property, were identified by his dental records. His widow, Linda Allen, broke down in tears upon hearing the confirmation. "I knew it was him," she said in a trembling voice during a later interview with reporters. "I knew, but hearing they found him out there like that, it felt like losing him all over again." For each family that came forward, there was first relief, then devastation. Toby Green, the friendly landscaper whose vanishing had unsettled his close-knit neighborhood, was another of the identified victims. His loyal German shepherd Max, who had been tied to a fence near Green's last job site, had become a tragic symbol of loyalty for the Lakewood community. Green's remains were found in one of Harris's shallow backyard graves. The identifying clue? A small, rust-streaked dog tag Toby often wore on a chain around his neck, engraved with Max's name. The identification process wasn't always tied to loved ones waiting desperately for answers. Some victims were transitory, living life on the margins without anyone actively searching for them. One such individual was a traveling salesman who had last been traced to Lakewood from hotel registry records that showed he'd stayed in town in early 1981. His body was partially identified through a gold-plated tie clip found among his remains, engraved with the name of the company he worked for. Medical records filled in the blanks, but the haunting reality was this: Edward Harris had chosen victims who were almost designed to slip through society's cracks. Some of these folks had no one, Laura Peterson admitted during an internal briefing. "We found their names not because anyone reported them missing, but because we were digging through paperwork and tracing random fragments of their lives. There's a kind of loneliness in that I can't even imagine." A particularly gut-wrenching case involved the honeymooning couple whose family had received a postcard shortly before their disappearance. Alan and Grace Parker, fresh out of college and traveling cross-country, had been reported missing by their parents after their communications stopped abruptly in late 1980. Their smiling photographs had been included with dozens of others on the town's local bulletin board of the missing, a board that became a grim symbol of Lakewood's loss. Their remains, found together in a single grave site under what used to be an old compost heap in Harris's backyard, were identified with the help of the clothes they were last seen wearing. Grace's engagement ring, inscribed with Forever A&G, became the final piece of evidence that confirmed their identities. But not all stories ended with such formal closure. The 6 unidentified victims confounded investigators. Some of these individuals had suffered complete decomposition, leaving behind only bare skeletal remains with few clues as to their identities. For others, there were no missing persons reports in nearby towns that matched their descriptions. These nameless victims became enduring scars on the case, symbols of the kind of lives Edward Harris preyed upon, the invisible, the overlooked, the ones no one thought to miss. "We kept asking ourselves the same question," Detective Jim Whitaker said during one of his rare interviews years later. "How can someone go their whole life without anyone out there wondering where they are? No friends, no family fighting for answers?" It wasn't just Harris's crimes that were dark. It was the realization of how alone some people lived. The process of identifying victims was also mired in bureaucratic hurdles. With 17 sets of remains and potentially more victims not yet uncovered, records needed to be shared with agencies across state and even national borders. Local authorities received a flood of missing persons inquiries after the Harris house became national news. Tips poured in, from concerned relatives to frantic friends clinging to the faint hope that someone they hadn't heard from in decades might still be out there, their stories simply untold. Sorting through these leads became a full-time job for a separate task force assigned to support the case. One of the more frustrating setbacks was the condition of the bodies exhumed from Harris's backyard. The shallow graves were too exposed to time and weather, leaving many remains irreparably damaged. Evidence that might have sealed a positive ID had been lost to the elements, forcing investigators to rely on circumstantial evidence wherever possible. And in some cases, there simply wasn't enough to go on. The unidentified 6, as the local press dubbed them, left scars not only on the case, but on Lakewood itself. Over the years, memorial ceremonies were held for these victims, even as their identities remained unknown. "We couldn't save their lives," said one grieving community member at a vigil, "but we won't erase their memories. They mattered, even if we never learn their names." For the families who did receive answers, the closure was bittersweet. Jim Whitaker and Laura Peterson personally delivered the results of each identification whenever they could, providing what little empathy they could muster despite their own exhaustion. It never got easier, Laura admitted. Every time we knocked on a door, we were carrying someone's worst nightmare in our hands. By the end of the investigation, 6 victims would remain nameless, their stories left unfinished. But for the other 11, the families at least had one thing: answers. In a case that exposed the horrifying depths of darkness and human cruelty, sometimes even the smallest sliver of closure could feel like a miracle. Trial and sentencing. By the time Edward Harris stood trial in July of 1985, the small town of Lakewood had become a storm of grief, anger, and relentless media attention. The faces of his 17 victims were plastered across newspapers and evening news broadcasts, their names used as mournful cries for justice. But justice didn't feel inevitable. In fact, it felt fragile, like a thread that could snap under the weight of such horrors. For the families of the victims, the trial wasn't just about punishing Edward Harris. It was about giving meaning to their loved ones' lives and affirming that they hadn't simply disappeared. They had been taken, and someone needed to pay. The criminal case against Edward Harris was, on paper, airtight. The physical evidence found at his house, the bodies, the freezer, the personal belongings of several victims, painted him as the undisputed perpetrator of the crimes. Investigators painstakingly connected him to each of the victims, piecing together the timeline and method surrounding their deaths. But Harris's defense team wasn't going to let him go down without a fight. With Harris facing the death penalty, the stakes couldn't have been higher, and every piece of evidence was scrutinized to ensure no stone was left unturned. The trial began in a packed courtroom in downtown Cleveland. The modest courthouse had been transformed into the epicenter of a media frenzy, with reporters camped outside in makeshift tents, broadcasting live updates to a horrified nation. Cameramen snapped shots of Harris as he was led into court each day, shackled at the wrists and ankles, his expression as cold and emotionless as ever. His demeanor only deepened the public's fascination and hatred. Inside the courtroom, the families of the victims sat shoulder to shoulder in tense silence. Many gripped photos of their lost loved ones, clutching them like talismans against the crushing weight of the proceedings. Linda Allen, widow of Mark Allen, wore the same gold locket she'd been given by Mark years before his death, her hands trembling as she listened to the prosecution describe how her husband's skeletal remains had been found buried in Harris's backyard. Toby Green's sister sat with a handkerchief clenched in her fist, staring down Harris with an expression of barely contained fury. Other relatives wept quietly, unable to look at the man who had stolen so much from them. The case against Harris was led by District Attorney Andrew Coleman, a tenacious prosecutor known for his methodical, no-nonsense approach in court. His opening statements were delivered with a relentless precision that struck at the very heart of the jury's emotions. "What Edward Harris did to these people goes beyond murder," Coleman declared in his deep, gravelly voice, pacing slowly before the jury. "He hunted them, he isolated them, he dehumanized them, and then he erased them. This trial isn't about debating his guilt, it's about recognizing the unimaginable cruelty inflicted by a man who saw human lives as disposable. It's about justice for the victims whose voices were silenced forever." The evidence presented during the trial was both overwhelming and harrowing. Through stark images of the crime scene, the jury was shown the battered remains of Harris's basement, his grotesque burial ground, and the freezer where one of his most recent victims had been found frozen in mid-scream. Personal belongings recovered from the property, like the tie clip and engagement ring, gave tangible weight to the tragedy. Testimonies from forensic experts detailed the trauma many of the victims' bodies had endured: restraints, signs of struggle, blunt force trauma, and strangulation. Every detail added another piercing nail to Harris's coffin. One of the most chilling moments in the trial came when the prosecution introduced Harris's journal into evidence. The book, warped from years of neglect, contained fragmented scribbles that spoke volumes about his psyche. Quotes like, "No one's coming for them," and "Move them when the ground feels easy," were read aloud in court. Each word acted like a dagger, striking both the courtroom and the families who had always dreaded just how much these crimes were planned. Defense attorney Margaret Fuller faced an uphill battle. Knowing that an outright acquittal was impossible, she aimed instead to spare her client from a death sentence. The defense argued that Harris's abusive childhood and spiraling mental health had warped his sense of reality, claiming he wasn't fully capable of understanding the moral consequences of his actions. Several witnesses were called to testify about Harris's abusive father, and the years Edward spent in isolation as a boy. A psychologist took the stand, painting Harris as the product of neglect and domination, trying, but failing, to cast sympathy on the man who had destroyed so many lives. Harris didn't grow up a monster, Fuller argued during her closing statements. He was made into one. His actions, while horrifying, stem from a mind broken by trauma and a life filled with rejection. He didn't kill out of malice. He killed because he had never understood what it meant to connect. Had someone protected him when he was a boy, we wouldn't be here today. But the attempt to humanize Harris fell flat. Jurors visibly stiffened as Fuller spoke, and the collective weight of the evidence loomed too large for anyone to excuse his crimes. The prosecution seized the opportunity to dismantle the defense's argument. "Edward Harris is not the victim here," Coleman thundered in his rebuttal. "The true victims are the 17 human beings whose lives were stolen by his hands. His upbringing does not absolve him of responsibility. His meticulous planning, his cold deliberation, and his complete lack of remorse show exactly who Edward Harris is. He is a predator. And predators don't deserve our forgiveness, they deserve our judgment." The trial lasted 6 weeks, and every day was a fresh wound for the victims' families. Having to hear the details of their loved ones' final moments, imagining the fear and helplessness they must have felt, was almost unbearable. But they stayed, resolute, determined to see justice served. When the jury finally returned their verdict, the courtroom was silent enough to hear the shuffling of paper as the foreman reviewed the decision. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Edward Harris, guilty. The word hung in the air for a moment, a collective exhale held by every person in the room. Guilty. The word was both validation and a painful reminder of what had been lost. The sentencing phase was equally emotional. Family members were given the chance to address the court, sharing stories of their lost loved ones and the enduring pain Harris had inflicted. Linda Allen described her late husband as a kind, hard-working man who had always put his family first. Toby Green's mother sobbed as she spoke about the laughter her son had brought into every room, and how his dog Max still sat by the door every evening, waiting for him to come home. The words from these families painted vivid pictures of lives that had been stolen too soon, making it clear to the jury that justice could only come in its severest form. In the end, Edward Harris was sentenced to death by lethal injection, a decision that sent waves of relief through the families but also left them with an ache that no punishment could erase. Even as he was led away in shackles, Harris remained stoic. When asked if he had any response to the proceedings, his answer chilled the room. "They were nothing. No one even noticed they were gone, until I made them matter." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Harris's words hanging like a poison in the air. He had offered no apologies, no regrets, no acknowledgement of the lives he had shattered. He was, to the very end, the cold and indifferent predator that Lakewood would never forget. For the families, Harris's sentencing marked the end of a legal battle, but it didn't mend the wounds. Justice had been served, but the scars of his actions would linger forever. Lakewood had become infamous as the setting of one of the most horrifying serial killings in modern history, and for the people who lived there, the echoes of the trial would haunt the town for years to come. The long-term impact on the community. The trial of Edward Harris may have concluded with a verdict and sentencing, but for the small town of Lakewood, the nightmare didn't end in a courtroom. The discovery of such horrific crimes in their seemingly picturesque community left scars that ran deep, far beyond the victims' families. The long-term impact of Harris's actions reverberated through every street, every home, and every interaction, transforming the town's identity forever. For decades, Lakewood had been the quintessential American suburb, tree-lined streets, white picket fences, a tight-knit community where neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles. It was a place where children played freely until sunset, where locked doors were optional, and where trust was as much a part of daily life as morning coffee. But in the wake of Harris's arrest, trust became a casualty, a critical, unseen victim of his appalling crimes. A town consumed by fear. In the months following Harris's trial, the idyllic facade of Lakewood cracked under the weight of paranoia. Town meetings, once cheerful affairs centered on school fundraisers and parade planning, became hotbeds of fear and suspicion. Residents whispered about who might have known something and failed to speak up. Others gazed warily at their neighbors, wondering how someone like Edward Harris could have hidden in plain sight for so long. "It felt like we'd all lost our innocence overnight," said longtime resident Margaret Hooper. "Lakewood used to feel safe, like we were all part of one big family, and then, suddenly, we were strangers. People started looking at each other differently. No one knew who to trust anymore. The fear extended even further for those who had lived close to Harris's property, on the quiet outskirts of town. The modest, nondescript house where Harris had carried out his reign of terror became a symbol of evil that many couldn't bear to look at. Families who had shared backyards and barbecues with Harris now faced the grim reality that they had lived beside a monster. Even after the house was purchased, raised, and replaced with an empty lot, the unease remained. "I used to let my kids play outside without thinking twice. Now I can't even let them walk to school alone," said one neighbor from Elm Street. "If someone like Ed could do what he did, how do you ever feel safe again?" A legacy of distrust. The effects weren't just emotional, they were behavioral. For years, Lakewood residents began adopting a more guarded way of life. Neighborhood watch programs sprung up seemingly overnight, parents refused to let their children out of sight, and front doors that had rarely been locked were reinforced with deadbolts and security systems. Some people even moved away, unwilling to stay in a town that had become synonymous with tragedy. Businesses, too, felt Harris's shadow. The local hardware store where Harris had occasionally purchased rope was boycotted by some residents who associated it with his crimes. The diner where one of his victims worked saw a sharp drop in business as locals avoided any reminders of the case. "It's like everything in this town carries his fingerprints," said the owner of the diner. "No matter where you go, you're reminded of what happened." Over time, this atmosphere of distrust began to erode the close bonds that once defined Lakewood. People were less willing to help their neighbors, less likely to offer spare keys or babysitting services to anyone other than immediate family. As one resident put it, "The community we had before Harris, that sense of safety and belonging, it's gone, and I don't think it's ever coming back." Trauma for the families. For the families of Harris's victims, the pain didn't end with the verdict. Many struggled to process the dual horrors of losing their loved ones and discovering the monstrous way they were taken. While some families found solace in the community's outpouring of support, others felt isolated, unable to reconcile their grief with the public's obsession with the case. For years, the name Edward Harris loomed in headlines and true crime specials, reducing their personal tragedy to sensationalism. Linda Allen, widow of Mark Allen, spoke candidly about her struggles in an interview years after the trial. "Every time I hear his name, it's like ripping open the wound all over again. Mark wasn't just a victim of Harris, he was my husband, he was a father, and now he's become part of this story that everyone talks about. But they don't really know him, they don't know us." For some, the trauma extended across generations. Children who had been too young to fully understand Harris's crimes at the time grew up in the shadow of the town's dark history. Many of these young residents described feeling a lingering sense of unease that shaped their formative years. "Lakewood isn't just where I grew up," said one former resident in their 20s. "It's also the place where I learned people aren't always what they seem. It's hard to trust anyone after you've seen what this town went through." Media spotlight and unwanted fame. As the trial brought national attention to Lakewood, the town became infamous overnight and in many ways never escaped its newfound notoriety. For years to come, journalists, documentary filmmakers, and true crime enthusiasts would flock to Lakewood, retracing Harris's steps and interviewing anyone willing to talk about him. For a community desperate to heal, this influx of curiosity seekers felt more like an invasion. "They treated us like a tourist attraction," said one resident bitterly, "as if what happened here was some kind of story for their entertainment, not the real lives of real people." Local officials worked hard to combat the narrative surrounding Lakewood, launching campaigns to emphasize the town's strengths and resilience. But despite their efforts, Harris's crimes remained Lakewood's dark claim to fame. Even today, mention of the town in certain contexts almost always conjures the specter of Edward Harris and the 17 lives he stole. Lessons that linger. Despite the pain, the tragedy of Edward Harris left Lakewood with lessons that it eventually carried forward. For one, the investigation forced the town to reckon with how easily people like Harris could blend into the fabric of society. Residents began to value vigilance, not just against potential dangers but also for their neighbors' well-being. Quiet loners like Harris were no longer just ignored. People began to take notice of unusual behavior and to intervene when something seemed amiss. Lakewood also became a cautionary tale for other small towns. proof that evil isn't confined to dark alleys in big cities. It can thrive in the unnoticed cracks of any community, even one as outwardly idyllic as Lakewood. The tragedy also highlighted broader issues, including the invisibility of transient workers and socially isolated individuals, many of whom became easy prey for Harris. In remembering the victims, Lakewood was reminded of the importance of recognizing and valuing the humanity in everyone, even the overlooked and forgotten. A town rebuilt, but forever changed today, Lakewood is no longer the same place it was before Edward Harris was exposed, but it has rebuilt itself in ways both big and small. New families moved in, new businesses opened, and children once again played in yards and cul-de-sacs, but the memory of Harris and the devastation he caused lingers quietly in the background. Annual vigils honor the lives of his victims, and a memorial plaque stands in the town square, a solemn reminder of the 17 who were lost. "We've learned how to live with what happened," said Margaret Hooper, now one of Lakewood's oldest residents. "But we'll never forget. Harris didn't just scar the lives he touched directly, he scarred this whole town, and we've had to carry that weight every day since." Some might say Lakewood's story is one of survival, of a community that, though battered, remained standing in the wake of unthinkable horror. Others might see it as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the shadows that can hide even in the brightest of places. Either way, the impact of Edward Harris's crimes will never truly fade. For the people of Lakewood, the monster may have been captured, but the echoes of his deeds will ripple through their history forever. Profound lessons from a horrific crime. The story of Edward Harris is one that leaves behind more than just a list of victims and a trail of grief. It leaves a haunting realization about humanity, community, and the dark corners of the human psyche that rarely see the light of day. For the people of Lakewood, the lessons learned from his crimes weren't just about safety or vigilance, they were about confronting the fragility of their own world, the ease with which evil can hide in plain sight, and the responsibility every individual carries for those around them. The danger of assumptions and complacency. One of the most jarring lessons from the Edward Harris case was the danger of assuming that monstrous behavior can only happen somewhere else. For years, Edward Harris blended seamlessly into the backdrop of his quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, he seemed like a solitary, unremarkable man, someone you might wave at on your way to the mail, but never think about again. He mowed his lawn, paid his bills, and lived without drawing undue attention to himself. He wasn't the shadowy stranger lurking in a dark alley. He was the guy down the street with the overgrown yard and the shy demeanor. "Looking back," one resident later reflected, "we thought we were the kind of town where this kind of thing just couldn't happen. We thought we were safe. We thought we were better than the horrors you read about in big cities. And that's exactly why it happened here." Complacency, both individual and institutional, played a critical role in allowing Harris to carry out his reign of terror undetected for so long. His victims were transient, invisible to society in many ways, and their disappearances were often ignored or dismissed as unremarkable. Police departments failed to connect the dots, neighbors failed to ask questions, and society as a whole failed to notice the cracks through which these lives slipped. "This case wasn't just a failure of one community," said Detective Laura Peterson during a later interview. "It was a failure of the way we as people treat those who seem unimportant." Harris knew how to take advantage of that. The humanity of the overlooked Edward Harris's chosen victims weren't prominent members of the community. They weren't politicians, CEOs, or celebrities. They were plumbers, landscapers, delivery drivers, and drifters. They were people whose lives existed on the margins, invisible to many, and seemingly unmissed when they disappeared. This was precisely why Harris targeted them. He chose his victims carefully, selecting individuals he thought no one would notice or care about. The case challenged Lakewood, and society as a whole, to reckon with how easily these people had been overlooked and discounted. Who were they before they became victims? What contributions had they made? How had they been allowed to slip through the cracks? These questions haunted the investigation and sparked long overdue conversations about social responsibility. "There's no such thing as a person who doesn't matter," Laura said during a speech at a memorial for the victims. "They didn't lose their lives because of who they were, they lost their lives because we didn't see them. That's a failure we all have to live with and learn from." Evil hides in plain sight. Stories like Edward Harris's reveal one of the darkest truths about humanity. Evil doesn't always come with a warning label, it doesn't always wear a mask or stand out in obvious ways. The most terrifying predators, it seems, are those who know how to blend in. Harris was the antithesis of the Hollywood villain. He didn't burst into rooms with fanfare or announce his intentions in dramatic fashion. He moved quietly, calculating every step, and relied on society's tendency to look the other way. He preyed on the same societal norms that insisted minding your own business was the polite thing to do. "It was the ordinariness of him that scares me the most," said one juror after Harris's trial. "He could have been anyone, someone you pass in the grocery store, someone fixing your sink. That's the kind of evil I'll never stop thinking about." The Harris case forced Lakewood residents to reevaluate what it means to truly know their neighbors. Should they have noticed something about Edward before it was too late? Were there signs that went unrecognized or unexplored? These questions didn't have easy answers, but they lingered like ghosts in the aftermath of his crimes. The importance of vigilance and empathy. Perhaps the most valuable lesson Lakewood learned from this tragedy was the need for vigilance, but not just the kind born of suspicion or fear. It wasn't enough to simply lock doors or install security cameras. What the community truly needed was a deeper connection to one another, a shared sense of empathy and responsibility for the people around them. In hindsight, many residents admitted that they had ignored things that seemed off about Harris. A neighbor recalled seeing him digging late at night in his backyard, but dismissed it as eccentric behavior. Others spoke about the faint odor around his property, but figured it wasn't their place to say anything. These acts of passive observation, while understandable in isolation, revealed a broader cultural tendency to avoid uncomfortable truths. "If there's one thing I've learned," said Margaret Hooper, a longtime resident of Lakewood, "it's that looking the other way isn't kindness. Sometimes kindness means asking the tough questions, even if it feels nosy or uncomfortable. Sometimes it can save a life." The tragedy also rallied the community in unexpected ways. Annual vigils for the victims became somber reminders of the importance of human connection. Schools began teaching children about empathy, encouraging them to look out for isolation or changes in their peers. Even neighborhood watch programs shifted their focus from monitoring strangers to checking in on one another. The legacy of resilience. Though Lakewood was forever changed by Harris's crimes, it would not allow itself to be defined by them. What emerged in the years after was a community more aware of its vulnerabilities but also more committed to resilience. The residents of Lakewood were forced to confront the darkest parts of human nature, but in doing so, they also uncovered their strength. "Bad things happen when we pretend they can't," said Detective Jim Whitaker during a remembrance ceremony for the victims. "But worse things happen when we let them define us." Lakewood isn't just a town where evil happened, it's a town that learned how to fight back, how to rebuild, and how to never forget. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from Edward Harris's terrifying spree is that safety isn't just about fences or locks, it's about people. It's about showing up for each other, asking questions, and ensuring that no one slips through the cracks. It's about acknowledging that, while we may never eliminate darkness entirely, we can shine a light on it by choosing vigilance over apathy, connection over isolation, and empathy over indifference. A shared responsibility for the future. Decades later, as the memories of Harris's crimes still linger, Lakewood remains a cautionary tale for other communities. But for those who lived through it, it's much more than that. It's a reminder of their shared responsibility to each other. "It's easy to think someone else will handle it," said Laura Peterson in an interview years after the case. "But in the end, the only way we stop people like Harris is by refusing to ignore the small things. It's those small things, a question, a call, a knock on a door, that can unravel evil before it takes root. That's what I'll carry with me forever."